Thank you, Lawrence, for that very kind introduction, and thank you to the AMEE team for inviting me to speak to you. I'm going to be talking about race, racism, and medicine, how they interact, and how perhaps we can unravel these threads. So I must explain and just briefly about my competing interests. I'm funded for my clinical work and my research work. I have unpaid roles with the National Cancer Research Institute and the Primary Academic Collaborative. Any media that I discuss, such as books and videos and papers and so on, I'm not paid to promote them. So with the Olympics so fresh in our minds and the Paralympics powering through, many of us look to and marvel at the brilliance of our athletes. In particular, if we look at middle and long distance runners, they're often dominated by African long distance runners. Many of them come from Kenya. What is the reason behind that? Is it because that being Kenyan gives people an inherent gift? Is it their genes? Is it their biology? Maybe it's even the training camp in Iten in Kenya that gives people an advantage, that spirit, that culture of championing long distance running. Similarly, if we look at short distance sprinting, for example, this is often dominated by Black athletes, some from the Caribbean, some from Africa, and some from all around the world. But why is that? Is it something about being Black that gives people an advantage, a genetic advantage? Or maybe it's the culture of championing sprinting. For example, Jamaica's #1 sport is sprinting, for example. Or how about these four people? Hans Krebs, Albert Einstein, Boris Pasternak, Daniel Kahneman. They're all men, they're all Nobel Prize winners, and they're all Jewish. And in fact, 1 in 5 Nobel laureates are Jewish. So what is it about being Jewish that gives people an advantage? Is it the fact that actually being Jewish gives people a genetic advantage? Or maybe in Jewish communities, academic excellence is celebrated through lots of different fields. These are the arguments that are put forward in Adam Rutherford's book, How to Argue with a Racist. If we turn our minds to the recent coronavirus pandemic, many people question why people from ethnic minority backgrounds are more likely to catch coronavirus and also die from coronavirus. Many academics, they often thought and relied on biological explanation that simply people from ethnic minority backgrounds had immune systems that just weren't strong enough. Others relied on biological explanations that maybe that it was due to low vitamin D levels. People from ethnic minority backgrounds tend to have darker skin, and often those with darker skin have lower levels of vitamin D. Vitamin D is useful and necessary for the functioning of the immune system. So therefore, maybe vitamin D was the missing link. However, if we try and pick out one clear factor, there simply isn't one clear factor that outlines why people from ethnic minority backgrounds are at increased risk of dying from coronavirus. Maybe they work in front-facing roles, such as they are cab drivers or bus drivers. They're more likely to catch coronavirus. And maybe they're less likely to get jobs which they are protected, or they come from poorer backgrounds, for example. This sets the backdrop for my presentation today. So I'll talk briefly about race, ethnicity, nationality, race theory, the effect of race in different parts of our life, and ways that we can challenge race and racism. If we look at the word ethnicity, it often describes a group of people with a shared culture. Occasionally, it means people with similar physical appearance. If we take nationality, for example, this is just another name for countries, lines on maps with common politics, for example. If you combine those words, ethnicity and nationality, you get the term ethno-nationalism. And this describes groups of people who believe that essentially that they have a shared biology, but they have a right to the country that they live in, for example. We take race, contrast that with ethnicity. Race often refers to people with similar physical attributes. So they look the same, but some people use it to mean culture or shared culture. So ethnicity leaning towards shared culture, sometimes meaning physical appearance, race leaning towards physical appearance, but sometimes meaning culture. They're often used, ethnicity and race often used interchangeably. So how did this system come about? Race is a human system. We've created it, but when and why did it come about? Well, around the 1700s, humans and biologists were trying to work out how to classify the world, trying to make sense of animals and plants, and humans were on that list as well. How do we make sense why humans look different and act different in different ways, for example? And Linnaeus was one of these biologists, and he came up with a system to classify different groups of people. And as you can see from the table, which I've taken a very short snippet of, you can see that he's classified people into 4 broad groups, and he's used a combination of physical characteristics. As well as that, he's used personal characteristics as well. So in putting in wisdom and greed and sadness and laziness. And it's not too far if you stretch your imagination and see that some of these stereotypes often percolate even from the 1700s all the way into modern day. Obviously, these personal characteristics are wrong and discriminatory. You can see how some of these stereotypes have held weight in the modern day. Let's look at race and health. How does race affect health? So when we talk about race and health, we can't really talk about that concept without talking about bias, the way our brains work. So bias is talked about in many circles, and in medicine, it's just starting to be talked about outside the med ed world. Bias is the way that our minds work. You've got these type 1 or fast unconscious processes, which allow us to make split-second decisions when we need to. Then you have these sort of slow processes, the conscious, thoughtful process, type 2 processes. And your brain is constantly switching between 1 and 2. So type 1 being the fast, type 2 being the slow. And the evolutionary basis for this was that our type 1 processes allowed us to identify predators, such as identifying from a distance whether that large cat was a threat without having to go very close, or maybe that small cat was not a threat, for example. As well as this, bias probably gave an evolutionary advantage because we were able to trust people within our group who might look the same as us compared to people who did not look the same as us and maybe were outside our group, for example. If I demonstrate to you that bias exists, I could do this right now. If I talk about the smell of the air, my accent, your feet on the ground, what you're seeing at the screen, your brain isn't thinking about these consciously. It's filtering out these unconscious processes all the time. And it's only because your brain is doing the hard work that you can actually focus on what's happening right now. And what some scientists and psychologists have thought of is that perhaps we can measure this bias. We can measure the way that the brain works and leans to one way and not the other. And that's called the Harvard Implicit Association Test, or IAT, if you look it up. And what it does, that test is meant to measure our biases. Now, what happens if we give this test to healthcare professionals? Now, you might be surprised to know, or maybe not that surprised, that healthcare professionals are biased. Of course, that's part of the human nature. And if we are discriminatory in a way, if we are discriminatory in that we are biased, does that affect patient outcomes? Does that affect the way our patients are treated, for example? And perhaps unsurprisingly, systematic review now, about 6 years old, did find that there is a difference, and that people who do possess this implicit bias to discriminate against those who come from ethnic minority backgrounds, they often, and that's associated with negative patient outcomes. We'll come towards bias and a bigger discussion about bias, perhaps towards the end. Racism, it's a brief description about, it's a prejudice against certain ethnic groups. People describe racism in different ways and subclassify it in different ways, such as internalized racism, perhaps what many people might call bias, for example, or frank, outright discrimination between individuals, interpersonal, or perhaps access to society's resources like housing and jobs, which many people would call systemic racism. Does racism actually affect people's health? So when you look at the data suggests that racism is actually a determinant of health. If you do encounter racism, people have negative physical and mental health outcomes. But how does this play out? Can you actually measure this at a biological level? So there's a couple of studies and large bodies of work that have come about that show that discrimination is associated with increased aging. So if you remember your genetics, that if we measure the length of telomeres, the little caps on the end of our chromosomes, when they are shorter, that suggests that there's increased aging. So discrimination is actually weakly associated with that marker of increased aging. As well as this, if you ask people who've been discriminated against and you measure the markers of inflammation, such as interleukin-6, discrimination is actually associated with increased markers of inflammation. But you might think, well, these are just cells. Cells aren't people. How might this actually play out? So if people are actually exposed to discrimination, so racism being an example of discrimination, that can affect people's heart function, their immune function, their nervous system, and through those mechanisms of aging and inflammation, that causes risk to people's physical and mental health. Maybe those people who have been discriminated against are more likely to take up negative behavioral responses, such as smoking and drinking alcohol, for example. Or maybe those who have been discriminated against are less likely to use healthcare services because they don't trust them. They're worried that they might be discriminated against in the future, and maybe they might not receive the treatment or the fair treatment that they deserve. As we move on, I'm going to talk a bit more about how race is hard baked into the fabric of medicine, into the guidelines. So I'm going to talk a bit about kidney function. So estimated glomerular filtration rate. So ordinarily, if we wanted to measure someone's kidney function, we could sit them down for 24 hours. We could measure how much of a chemical they produce, such as creatinine, or we could sit them down for 24 hours. That's not practical. We don't have enough time for that, especially in emergency situations where life and death is at stake. So you have to use an estimation. And what is the estimation we use? Well, we use a formula, and that formula comes from a study from 1999. And that study was done in the US, and that compared 200 Black people to 1,300 white people. And what it showed is that Black people, as it described in the study, African American people in the study, had an increased kidney function. So therefore, that we should use a multiplier to correctly estimate their kidney function. Now, this formula wasn't used in the US. It started being used all around the world, taking away the context in which this data was collected. But perhaps more worryingly, they measured that increased kidney function, suggested that all Black people have an increased muscle mass. And so they use these references, which quite frankly are pretty poor. If you look at the references they've used, they've compared very small numbers of adults, very small numbers of children, and come up with this hypothesis that all Black people, anywhere they are, all around the world, must have increased muscle mass. And what happens is when you falsely estimate that someone's kidney function is higher than it is, it has dangerous consequences to where they are treated when they have medical care. So for example, if you falsely estimate that someone's kidney function is higher than it is, what it means is that you give people medication that's sensitive to their kidneys at a higher dose. So you give people nephrotoxic doses of medication. They're more likely to receive renal replacement therapy, such as dialysis, later. They receive a transplant later. So race is hard bait into the institution. That has far-reaching consequences. But incidentally, as I'm talking to you today, this week, the British guideline maker, NICE, or NICE as we call it in the UK, they've completely got rid of the identifier, the multiplier, shall we say. They've said that we must ignore it because it has no basis, which is a fantastic thing to hear. I understand in the US there's been huge challenges about removing a race-based multiplier which doesn't have a strong evidence base. Some researchers, Vanessa Grubbs, a nephrologist in the US, she suggests that perhaps we should use cystatin C, for example. And that's a different chemical rather than using creatinine to estimate someone's kidney function. Some people say it's more expensive. She argues it costs $50,000 per year for a hospital, which is probably the same amount that people use on toilet paper, that a hospital spends on toilet paper, shall we say. And what happens is that when we don't understand the context in which this data occurs, then what happens is that we give often students and training healthcare professionals questions about how and why there are differences between ethnic groups and the diseases that they encounter. And what happens is that a lot of people suggest that it is due to inherent biology or genetics. And what that means is that it often means that those communities are disempowered from a community perspective, but also from a clinician perspective, because you feel that if it's biological and genetic, maybe there isn't that much that I can do about it. So what do you do in clinical practice? Do you ignore the guidelines? Because guidelines aren't rules, we've made them up. So if you understand the biological basis and the research and the data behind these guidelines, I think you'll be within your right to ignore those guidelines. For example, we've got a race-based blood pressure guideline in the UK. I understand the clinical basis and the research behind that guideline. I don't think it's useful for patients. I don't think it helps them in any way. So I feel that I can ignore it, but I have to leave it up to your own discretion for your own guidelines. As well as this, a lot of skin biology, skin medicine, dermatology is taught on lighter shades of skin, which means that those with darker skin are less likely to receive the care that they so desperately need. And what Malone Mukwende, a medical student at St. George's University of London, has done, he's created a handbook on clinical signs about how people can correctly identify skin conditions on darker skin tones. And I urge you to check this out at the next available opportunity. And perhaps most worrying, if you take into consideration the coronavirus pandemic, is the measure of oxygen saturation. And there's two ways, broad ways that you can measure oxygen saturation. That's using a meter on the end of your skin called a pulse oximeter, or you can take a blood sample. And what some researchers did last year, and this was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, was to compare the oxygen levels in the blood, which is the most correct level or correct measurement of oxygen that you can have, and compared it to the pulse measure of oxygen on someone's skin. And what they found is that for Black patients, there was a big difference in the actual blood measurement of oxygen compared to the actual measurement on the end of the skin, which meant that Black patients would often get sicker without anyone noticing, compared to white patients where the alarm bells will be ringing, for example, which is perhaps a very worrying thing when it comes to pulse oximetry. And this discussion of race really made me think about how we see medicine as a science. More often than not, especially members of the public, but also members of the profession, they see science, and specifically medical science, and as an objective science. So that medicine is perfect and it's free from outside influence. It's not influenced by politics, it's not influenced by research funders, it's not influenced by patient participation, and we can control for all these biases and come up with a pure answer at the end. But really, as we can see how race interacts with medicine, as it is a social construct and somehow has percolated into medicine. And that really has made me question about how objective medicine is, and that medicine is subject to the same influences as everything else is. It's subject to the influences of our funders, it's subject to influences of the politics at the time and societal norms. So far we talked a lot about clinical care and how that interacts with race. So I'm going to move on about where our knowledge comes from. So a couple of examples. So the Tuskegee experiment was an experiment where Black people in the United States were intentionally infected with an infectious disease called syphilis. And the purpose of the experiment was to see the natural history of the disease. And even when a treatment was available, they were not given the treatment for this disease. And many Black people died from syphilis. And it's probably not that surprising to imagine that if you are a Black person living in the United States, you might not trust healthcare providers or healthcare institutions if you're given this history of, quite frankly, unethical experimentation on people. As well as this, one of the fathers of modern gynecology, called John Marion Sims, we don't often talk about the knowledge required for Sims to become the father of modern gynecology. He's given his name to a piece of equipment called the Sims speculum, which is used to examine female genitalia. But what no one really talks about is that piece of equipment was developed through the experimentation on Black slaves. And their names, Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy, are only coming through now. And this is an artist depiction at the time, but we don't often talk about the trauma on Black and brown bodies and the experimentation that has happened for us to have this knowledge. And just a quick slide about leadership before we move forward. And this is a graph about representation of ethnic minorities in leadership positions in the UK in hospital trusts. So trusts are rough areas of often covering 1 or 2 or 3 different hospitals. And what it's showing is, as you go from left to right, you're becoming more senior as you go from left to right. And you've got these light blue bars, which are representative of ethnic minority staff. And as you get more senior, all the way up to band 5, you can see there's a bulge. So there's a large proportion of ethnic minority staff who are at band 5. But as you get more senior from band 5 to band 9, you can see ethnic minorities are less likely to be in high leadership positions. Question is, why is that? Is that because they weren't offered the opportunity? Is it because they didn't want to take it up? What is the reason behind these disparities that we see in leadership positions? And this is not a one-off scenario. It often occurs in many parts of clinical medicine, but also academia as well. So how does race affect everyday life? I'm going to bring to you maybe a couple of perhaps surprising examples for you, and then we'll move on to solutions. So one example was about bias in football commentary. Some of you may call football soccer, but on where I come from, we call it football. And what some researchers did was look at whether there was bias in football commentary in the 2019-2020 season. And what they found was that darker skinned players were more likely to be criticized over being praised. So darker skinned players more likely to be criticized than praised. As well as that, when talking about the merits of darker skinned players, commentators were more likely to mention their power and their speed and their strength rather than their work ethic or intelligence. So darker skinned players more likely to be praised over power and speed over their intelligence. How about children's books, for example? So in the UK, there's a study led by Professor Bold at University College London. And what she does every year is to look at percentage of children's book titles are from ethnic minority authors, as well as that, how many titles come from those authors. And overwhelmingly, we can see that the minority of books come from those ethnic minority authors. And often they are stories about the struggles and the challenges of children from ethnic minority backgrounds. And it's unsurprising if we look at the percentage and representation of those books in our bookshops and shelves and libraries, that perhaps our children are unaware of the struggles of children who don't necessarily look like them or sound like them, for example. So perhaps some solutions, perhaps some ways that we can move around this and challenge the impact of race and racism in medicine. So one for clinical medicine I think is really, really important is challenging race and assumed knowledge. Often we're using non-specific terms. For example, one of the ones is Caucasian, for example. That Caucasian relates to the Caucasus Mountains, which are on the border of Europe and Asia. So it doesn't actually relate to a race, for example, but most people use it to mean white, for example. And often when we look at the data and ethnic differences between different groups of people, what you can see is that we often don't mention or understand the context that that data occurs in, and then that data is then cited in other places to draw conclusions for other places in different contexts, which may or may not be relevant. And then lo and behold, that moves and shifts its way into medical guidance and then exam questions, for example. When we look at our leadership and how do we challenge about low numbers of ethnic minority leaders, for example, many people talk about bias. That was that system that I mentioned about this fast brain and slow brain. And many people say, well, because we are biased and we make stereotypes, then maybe we should make everyone do bias training. Now, making everyone do something doesn't mean that you're going to achieve the right outcomes that you want. And bias training, there isn't very good evidence in medical context, but outside medical context as well, that bias training has any improvement on long-term measures of bias, for example, using that test that I mentioned, the implicit association test. And bias training is good for increasing awareness of bias, but there isn't that much evidence to suggest it makes any difference. So from the Lancet paper last year, it suggested that we should do 3 things to improve bias training. If we mandate things, people don't often engage with it and they often mindlessly click through online modules. So we should measure people's motivation to start off with as a baseline. As well as this, we should give people strategies. It shouldn't be about raising awareness of bias. We should give people concrete strategies which they can personalize and tailor towards themselves, but how we can decrease our own biases, whether that's a checklist at key points, whether that's about making a diagnosis, or maybe it's about reflection, for example. And that's probably one of the few debiasing strategies that's got a okay evidence base that works. As well as that, bias training is often about awareness, like I mentioned, but not about how bias manifests. Bias manifests through verbal, non-verbal communication, how you are around people, how you talk to them, how they are dressed, whether they feel included, all these sorts of things. And we don't really teach that in bias training. And maybe if we did, maybe we'd actually have some concrete improvement in bias, for example. This is a paper that my team and we wrote about how implicit bias affects healthcare in different aspects of medicine, from clinical practice to research and decision making at making a diagnosis. You may want to have a look at it yourself. And perhaps when it comes to recruitment, maybe we should have blinded application for entry. It's difficult for those who are applying for senior positions because often people know about you, and it's easy to find lots of information about you. But if we blind those applications before interview, we know that there's definitely going to be a benefit, especially for people whose names do not sound European. I mean, there was an Oxford study a few years ago which showed that people who do not have European sounding names, they take much longer to get an interview compared to those who do have European sounding names. We should interview widely. The Rooney Rule was a rule done in the United States of America for interviewing American football coaches. And one thing they said, they didn't put quotas on it, but they said that you must interview widely for American football coaches, so we have appropriately diverse coaching staff. As well as this, something that's more controversial are pay gaps. So you may have heard of the gender pay gap. If we're talking about the ethnicity pay gap, if, for example, we published pay gap data, and let's say you found out that your friend or your colleague was doing the same work but earning more, would that compromise the way that you treated your friend or colleague? And if we published it, what are the ramifications of publishing pay gap data? As well as this, sticking towards leadership, it's important that we talk about accountability. There's a huge crisis in our leaders, and especially our political leaders, more than ever, that we don't really have trust in them because we don't feel they're held to the same standards as everyone else, for example. One example is, I'm taking a couple of ideas from Vince Molinaro, who's a business leader, and he talks about that often our leaders, they don't always appreciate that leadership is an obligation. It's a contract. It's not just that you're paid more. It's not just that you're there to manage people. You're there to serve people, and not everyone perhaps grasps that that's what leadership is. And actually putting it in writing and getting someone to sign it in ink, not electronically, in ink, may very well create improvements in accountability in our leadership. The other idea he talked about was accountability in our leaders. And one of the things that's particularly important he talked about was how we hold those leaders to account. And that is through the views about how the people they serve, so the people in the organizations, how they feel that their leaders are doing, whether they feel that their leaders are including everyone in the conversation, whether they are able to air their grievances about what's happening with the leadership in their organization. And perhaps the most important thing in this presentation is about conversations. Often discussions about race and racism are charged uncomfortably. People are worried about saying the wrong thing, being ignorant, saying the wrong thing, offending someone. But unless we have a dialogue, and perhaps we should always perhaps call out racism when it is there, but we don't often create spaces for people to get it wrong, to have uncomfortable conversation about race and racism. Where is a space that this can happen? Is it mandated spaces every week where it's voluntary, where the same faces come every week? Is it online? Is it face-to-face? Now, some place around the world that things are opening up in the pandemic. And often we often see that the responsibility to drive racial equality forward often is on the shoulders of those who are affected by racial inequality. So people from ethnic minority backgrounds, they often feel it's their responsibility to drive it forward. And often it's not always paid as well, so there isn't like a monetary value to it. So perhaps paid positions with accountable measures could be a step forward. But it's going to be difficult coming out of a pandemic where the economic systems have been thrown into disarray. Ultimately, we're all human beings. We crave classification, we crave belonging, we crave identity. And perhaps race isn't the most useful category, but it's a category that some perhaps people might align with because they feel there's that shared culture, even though that scientific basis for biology and genetics doesn't really exist. Maybe genetics specifically, so ancestry data, for example, is a good way of making a start about dismantling race. And even using countries and regions, these are just arbitrary lines on a map, and lines on a map have been moving since the start of time. I've got some links. I can put them up later into the chat, and that's it. And I look forward to any questions.
Well, Dipesh, that was fantastic. I mean, I think you got a lot of people thinking because I'm having trouble keeping up with the chat. And there's a lot of questions that have been coming up, and I'm going to try to prioritize them based on not only when they came in, but how often people are asking about a specific topic. Um, right off the bat, as I'm trying to do that, can you just comment a little bit, since we have a lot of health professions educators in this conference, where can the health professions education community begin to think about and incorporate the discussions on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and include some of this important data that you presented?
I mean, I think I would move them into three different categories. So I'd think about clinical care. I think when it comes to medical education, when you're teaching a topic, I think often history of medicine is just pushed far into touch. So it's pushed into the long grass. And perhaps for medical education, I think understanding where the knowledge comes from when you're teaching it is really, really important. And perhaps teaching the history of medicine with the topic is particularly valuable. I think perhaps when it comes to leadership, maybe this is a difficult one because I think a lot of people think about quotas. So having quotas for gender, ethnicity, and disability, and for example, but it's a really hard one because you want to make everything I suppose there's two concepts that are important: equality of opportunity, equality of outcome. So opportunity meaning that we give everyone a fair chance, but outcome meaning that we make sure that the outcome happens. That's the quotas. Right. And I suppose for clinical care, I think understand the context in which the data occurs that you're presenting to your students will be a good start.
Yeah, so, very early on in the presentation, you talked about type 1 and type 2, right? Which made me think of diabetes, but I know it wasn't. But Anna De Silva asked, how much of health inequalities are embedded into type 1 by medical education?
This is a difficult one because there's no way to prove that bias exists except on a interpersonal level. The only way you can often see it is through the outcome. So, for example, in the UK, we do a cancer patient experience survey, and we often find that people from ethnic minorities they feel less likely included in their care. But there's something about the interactions. There's something happening there. We can't put our finger on it, but we often, when you talk to patients like one-to-one, they might say, I wasn't treated fairly. I felt there was something going on. They said things that made me feel really uncomfortable. So I think it's one cog in a very big machine, but I think we can all do one thing and look at our biases. Maybe the test, I wouldn't beat yourself up too much about the test, but if you wanted to do the test, have a think about the test, reflect backwards, I think, and have a hard look on yourself. It's difficult to have a look in the mirror because you're looking in the mirror saying, I'm a bad person. I'm flawed, which not everyone wants to do.
No, I hear you. It's interesting. What you just said dovetails nicely with a series of questions and comments that came in about there's huge inequities in research paper authorship, as well as between writers in high income versus low and middle income countries due to a publication bias, likened to sort of institutional racism. And there were some really interesting comments from Maura Polanski and Iman Aysan, including Iman said, journal editors often do not seriously consider manuscripts from low income countries for a variety of assumptions. And while she wasn't able to give a reference, she certainly had good anecdotal evidence of that happening. Is this something you could comment on?
Yeah, so there's definite evidence about this. It's Matthew Harris's work from Imperial. It's definitely in the paper that we reviewed because we looked at that, and we called it publication bias, I think. So it's not definitely a personal thing. It definitely happens, and there's evidence to show this happens. Both at the way we attribute prestige to high income institutions, and the research that comes out of there. Everyone thinks about Harvard, Oxford, Cambridge, but actually, what are we doing? what we're doing, we're channeling research into certain institutions, which then attract all the funding, and therefore take funding away from other people. So evidence-based does exist. I do think blinding, I still don't understand why we don't have blinding before we get to peer review. It has to happen, but unless we make sure it happens, we're not going to achieve anything. We're not going to get equity.
Thank you. Trevor, before I go on to the next question, is there anything you'd like to ask or jump in about?
No, not really. I'm just still processing all that, and I'm just that sentence has really resonated with me. We be comfortable with uncomfortable conversations. It's something that we do shy away from all too often. You know, there are people on this in this session who are leaders in their field. And I think that applies to a lot of those leaders. So if you can just, and one thing to take home is that be uncomfortable with uncomfortable conversations.
So thanks, Trevor. I just wanted to make sure there wasn't anything burning that you wanted to ask. So Carol Gray asks, and this is sort of a hopeful question. I like hopeful questions, Dipesh. Do you think that things will gradually improve as the current health profession students graduate and move into clinical practice?
Yes, definitely. I think hope is probably one of the biggest tools we have. I think that the generations that are coming through now of medical students, they're more, I feel, without stereotyping generations of people, but I do think they're often more open to radical ideas, especially those around inclusivity. And so I think, yeah, I'm hopeful. I think we all should be. If we don't think it's going to be hopeful, then everything will be bad. We've got to be hopeful. We've got to be positive. Otherwise, nothing will be better.
Yeah, you know, there's a lot of resonating about the dark skin bias in teaching dermatology. Somebody brought up the fact that when given a choice between venipuncture arm mannequins, students often lean towards the white versus the dark because they're easier to do. But that leads to an issue with when you get to clinical practice and you have a dark arm, it's a lot harder to do. Are there other examples that you've seen?
I mean, when it comes to taking blood from, I don't think there is. I mean, in reality, there's no difference at all. So I think with the models, I think the point you're making is that obviously everyone's had a go on the light skin model, so it's actually easy to puncture the skin. But I mean, I think we should all have a go on the difficult mannequins because we should, right? Examples, other examples. I can't think of too many. I put the prime ones in the presentation. Pass. If something comes up, I'll come back to it.
Absolutely. Joe Varney said, first of all, fantastic plenary, thank you. And then could you say a bit more about the decolonization of the medical curriculum?
Yeah, it's a very charged word. I'm a fan of what it represents. I think the actual term can really turn people away from it. So for those of you, I'm sure most people do know, I think there was a workshop on decolonizing the medical curriculum, I think yesterday or today, I think. But it's about looking at the roots of how and why the scientific basis of medicine is created and how that affects patients and how we can be better. Could you repeat the question again? Sorry.
Oh, well, I scrolled away from it. How can we get to the decolonization of the medical
How can
curriculum?
we get to it?
Yeah.
I think it's about challenging the evidence base about what exists and just asking, is that true and why? And often not all clinicians and all medical educators will be open to this. Some people might be very defensive and say, I don't know, I'll look it up or something like that, or I don't know anything about it. But I think if we look at the evidence base, see where the data actually came from and how it's in the guidelines, for example, I think that's the first step. There is in the UK, there's something coming out from the Becoming a Doctor team. They asked me to look at how their guide to decolonize the medical curriculum, which should be coming out soon. I have no idea exactly when it's coming out, but you could ask them. So you could do that basically, but you could look at every single specialty and look at the evidence base for it.
Great. So Luisa Nguti says, as a medical student, I'm curious what your opinion is on the role university admission habits plays. I'm from Kenya, where racism wouldn't be as pronounced, but the situation is clearly different in other countries.
Medical admission process. I mean, in the UK, we have something called like widening access to medicine or increasing access to medicine. That's a very big initiative. And I think it is done all around the world. I think that those initiatives are really good. They give prospective medical students a way to get in. I do think that medicine is very interesting because it's about on the theme of widening access, because medicine in itself is a middle class profession. So if you weren't from the middle class, you become part of the middle class, and then you're trying to open access to people who might not necessarily be middle class. I mean, if you look in the UK, predominantly we see the majority of doctors come from private school backgrounds, for example. But widening access programs are a place to, if you want to have a look, see what's happening.
Yeah, I also think, and Trevor, if you'd like to pop in on this as well, I also think it has to do with the question has to do with the admissions process and how do we ensure that there's diversity amongst our health professions students as much as anything else.
I think it's interesting because it comes back to what Dipesh said earlier about choosing which medical school you go to. I come from the northwest of England, and we, I like to think we've got almost a very global population in the northwest of England. I'm very proud of that. But if you talk about admissions to school, medical school, people from the northwest stay in the northwest, not because they think they're better medical schools and want to go there, because I think and this is purely anecdotal from chatting to people, they do not want to go south. And I apologize, Dipesh, because yours medical school is that they're less well accepted, and they're much more accepted in the northeast and northwest medical schools. And again, it's pure anecdotal. I don't know of any papers that have been written on that.
I mean, one thing I was going to say is about something I read about how law is carried out in the UK, and what one of the lawyers was saying is that we'd actually have a much fairer legal system if we anonymize people and you couldn't see the witness whoever was testifying. And in some ways, I wonder whether, I mean, medical school admissions has changed a bit since there was lots of interviews. Now you've got these stations, which are meant to standardize everything. But I think if we had a standard accent, which that person would speak through, and we had a standard, we couldn't see them, I think we probably would have a much better, we'd have fixed a lot of things. But there's that human aspect, I guess you're gonna miss, aren't you? That gut feeling, whatever that is that bias? Is that we like that person because we think they come from the same background as us? I don't know.
It's interesting, in the United States, if you look back 10, 15, 20 years, you'd see a very different gender makeup as well as racial makeup in the student population. And there were even historically Black schools to ensure that the workforce had diversity. I think today you'd see it differently. There's another question from Marune Amzil, which is, I'm curious to know if there are any strategies to address the racial bias that health professionals face from their patients and relatives. So sort of in that direction.
That's a tricky one, because obviously you've got a relationship to maintain, haven't you? And sort of like even as a simple question such as, where are you from, can really drive some people up the wall, because they've probably had it so many times before and it's asking the same question. You're thinking, what's this got to do with anything? I think it's difficult. I think if you're a medical student, you're trying to challenge, if someone makes an inappropriate comment, for example, I mean, how do you're trying to get history from them, make an inappropriate comment. What do? I mean, you can't say anything back to them, but if it's something that's deeply inappropriate, then you feel desperately uncomfortable, then I think you should get a senior person to tell them about what's happened and just if they need be chaperone, or if you feel confident enough. I think one useful method is Socratic questioning. I don't know if the audience really appreciate it. So it's asking questions which you may know the answer to, but sometimes kind of make some people question their own assumptions. And it's a gentle way of asking someone, is that what you really meant? Is this a relevant question? For example. But yeah, it's a tricky one. It's a tricky one. I mean, it does happen. It still happens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it
That's
represents all of there's issues in diversity, equity, inclusion in all directions. It's not a simple topic to cover, nor was it a simple topic for you to cover in a brief plenary presentation. I think you did a fantastic job. There are a lot of comments coming in just back and forth that are not questions, but sort of supportive of some of the points that you made. So I would encourage you to take a look at the chat in the playback, because I think a lot of what you said resonated with people. And I think a lot of what you said not only resonated, but made people reflect and look outwards as well as inwards. So I don't know if there's any closing words you'd like to say before I turn this back over to Trevor.
No, I just want to thank, I'm really, really grateful for the opportunity to be here. I mean, and I'm really glad that it's resonated with people. And I want to thank team at AMEE. Thank you, Lawrence, for chairing. Thank you, Trevor. Thank you.